Everyone warned me. 6 boys and a man you've never met, on a ranch 200 miles from anyone who'd remember your name. My aunt said I'd be a servant with a wedding ring. The woman who sold me the train ticket said it plainer, that I was either brave or a fool, and that out here the two looked the same until the snow came. What none of them told me was the thing I learned standing in a stranger's kitchen, my hands shaking, 6 pairs of eyes deciding whether I was a thief come to steal their mother's place. That the hardest door in the world to walk through is the one a grieving child is holding shut, and that sometimes you don't open it by knocking. You open it by setting one more plate at the table and waiting to see who sits down. This is the story of the dinner that changed all of us. But first you have to understand how badly I wanted to run. The first thing I did when I stepped off the train at Lewisham Crossing was count the buttons on my coat. 6. I always count when I'm afraid. It's a habit I've never been able to break, and I'd had it since I was a girl, when my mother used to say a frightened mind needs something to hold and most things won't hold still. Buttons hold still. So I counted them, 1 through 6, and then I made myself look up, because a grown woman of 26 standing on a platform counting her own coat is not a sight to inspire confidence in anybody, least of all the man I had come to marry. He was easy to find. He was the only one not moving. The other people on that small wooden platform had somewhere to be, and the sense to go there before the wind cut through them. Ammon Rourke stood by the freight scale with his hat in both hands, turning it slow, the way a man turns a thing when he doesn't know what to do with his fingers. He was taller than I'd let myself imagine and older too. There was gray at his temples and a deep weathering across his face that the single photograph he'd mailed me had been kind enough to soften. He looked like a fence post that had outlasted 3 fences. He looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. "Miss Vane," he said, not a question. He'd seen me counting, I think. He had the decency not to mention it. "Mr. Rourke." My voice came out steadier than I felt, which I have always considered the one small mercy God reliably grants me. We stood there a moment, the two of us, with 11 years of my letters and his between us, and not one of them any use now that we were flesh and breath in the cold. I had imagined this meeting 100 ways on the train. In none of them had I felt this hollow doubt, this aware of my own hands. I had a small leather notebook in my coat pocket, and I touched it the way some people touch a cross. Inside it, I had written everything I knew about him and his family, copied out from his letters in my careful schoolteacher's hand, because I have always believed that if you know a thing's name, you are halfway to not being afraid of it. I knew the boys' names. I had practiced them on the train until the woman across from me asked if I was praying. "The wagon's this way," Ammon said. He reached for my trunk and I let him take it, and that was the first thing I learned about him, that he carried a heavy thing as though apologizing to it, as though everything he lifted had once been somebody's. The drive out to the ranch took the better part of 3 hours. I had thought we'd talk. We didn't much. He pointed things out, the river that froze solid by December, the dead cottonwood the lightning took the summer his wife passed, the line of his property where the fence sagged because there was too much work and not enough of him. He said my wife the way you'd touch a bruise to see if it still hurt. It did. I could hear that it did. "What was her name?" I asked. It wasn't in his letters. He'd written my late wife every time, the way you'd wrap something so you didn't have to look at it. He was quiet so long, I thought I'd ruined everything before we'd reached the house. "Della," he said finally. The horse's breath smoked in the cold. "Della Rourke. She's buried up on the rise behind the barn. The boys go up there. I let them." He glanced at me, and there was something almost like a warning in it, though it wasn't unkind. Some days more than others. I wrote nothing in my notebook. Some things you don't put on paper. But I held the name the way you'd hold an egg, carefully, knowing it could break in my hands and that the breaking would be my fault. The house came up out of the land like it had grown there. Low and long, with a porch that sagged at one end and a chimney trickling smoke into the white sky. And on that porch, In a row I would later learn they had arranged entirely on their own without their fathers knowing, stood the 6 boys. I counted them before I could stop myself. 1 through 6. The eldest stood at the end nearest the door like a sentry. Carrick, I knew from the letters 16, the spit of his father in the jaw, the only one tall enough to look me near level. He did not take his hands out of his pockets. He did not look away from me, and there was nothing of welcome in his face. There was the opposite of welcome. There was a boy guarding a grave. Beside him, Bly, 14, narrower, watchful, the kind of quiet that misses nothing and forgives little. Then the twins, Sem and Job, 11 and identical down to the cowlick, except one of them had a scab on his chin and the other didn't, which was the only way I'd learned to tell them apart for the first 3 weeks. Then Pate, 8, who hid half behind the twins and peered out with eyes too big for his face. And last, smallest, holding on to the porch rail with both fists because the boards came up to his chest, Whitman. Whit. 5 years old, and he was the only one of them looking at me the way a child is supposed to look at a new thing, with curiosity instead of judgment, with his whole open face. He was also, I would learn, the only one who couldn't quite remember his mother. And I have thought many times since that this was no accident, that the youngest forgive first because they have the least to forgive against. Boys, Ammon said, and his voice changed, got bigger, got more careful, the voice of a man who has had to be 2 parents and isn't sure he's managed one. This is Miss Eleanor Vane. She's come a long way. Nobody said anything. The wind moved across the yard, and somewhere a loose board knocked against the barn, knock, 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 like a question nobody wanted to answer. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps with my trunk beside me and my notebook in my pocket and 6 children weighing me, and I understood with a clarity that took the breath out of me that the letters had been a lie. Not Ammon's lie. Mine. I had told myself I was coming to a man. I was coming to a family that had already buried the woman whose place I was meant to fill, and not one of them had agreed to the filling. "Hello," I said. My voice did the steady thing again. "Bless it, Carrick, Bly." I went down the line and I named every one of them the way you'd lay down cards. Sem, Job, Pate, and you must be Whit. The youngest one blinked. "How'd you know my name?" "Your father told me about all of you," I said. "In letters. I read them so many times I think I know you better than you know me. That hardly seems fair, does it?" Whit considered this with the deep gravity that 5-year-olds bring to genuine questions. But before he could answer, Carrick stepped down off the porch, 1 step, 2, putting himself between me and his brothers without seeming to do it on purpose, the way a man steps in front of a thing he intends to protect. "You can have the room off the kitchen," he said, flat. "Ma's things are still in the big room. We didn't move them." "Carrick," Ammon said low. "We didn't," the boy said again, and it wasn't to his father he said it. It was to me. "We didn't move them, and you won't either, and don't you forget it." "Then I'll take the room off the kitchen," I said. "Thank you, Carrick." I thanked him on purpose. I have found that you can disarm a great deal of hostility by accepting its terms before it can become a fight, and I have found that boys who are braced for war don't always know what to do with someone who lays down her arms. He stared at me a second longer. Then he picked up my trunk, taking it from his father without a word, his thin arms straining under it, and carried it inside. I learned later he did that so I'd know whose house it was, so I'd see he could carry the weight I'd come to ease. I let him. I have rarely been right about anything in my life, but I was right about that. The first week I cooked badly. I want to be honest about it, because the way these stories usually get told, the woman steps into the kitchen and the bread rises and the children are won by sundown, and that is not how it went, and it is not how anything goes. I burned the first pan of biscuits because I didn't know the stove ran hot on the left. The beans were underdone on Tuesday. I oversalted a stew so badly that Bly took 1 bite, set down his spoon with great deliberation, and looked at me with an expression I can only call vindicated. Nobody told me when the things I made were good, which were few. Everyone told me, in the eloquent silence of food left on plates when they were bad, which were many. And the whole time, Della's kitchen watched me. That was the part that nearly undid me. It wasn't the boy's coldness, though that was real and constant and wore at me like wind on stone. It was the kitchen. Her hooks, her arrangement, her chipped blue crockery, the worn place on the floor where she must have stood 10,000 mornings, that I now stood in and could feel myself standing in wrong. There was a jar of dried sage on the shelf in handwriting that wasn't mine. There was an apron on the back of the door that I didn't dare touch and couldn't bring myself to move. The whole room was a held breath. The whole house was a woman who'd stepped out and was expected back, and I was the stranger caught standing in her place. At night I lay in the narrow room off the kitchen and counted the cracks in the ceiling. There were more than 6, so I had to count them twice and lose my place and start again, which was somehow a comfort. I thought about the train. I thought about how the woman who sold the ticket had said brave or a fool, and how she'd been right that out here they looked the same, but wrong that you couldn't tell which you were. You could tell. A brave woman would have stayed and fought for these children's hearts. A fool would have stayed because she had nowhere to go and was too proud to admit it. I lay there most nights not knowing which I was, and I think that not knowing is the truest thing I can tell you about that month. Ammon was kind, I'll say that. He was kind in the careful, exhausted way of a man with nothing left over, which is a real kindness even when it's thin. He never raised his voice to me. He thanked me for every meal, even the ruined ones, which I came to understand was its own quiet apology. At night he slept in the big room, Della's room, and I slept off the kitchen, and we were married in name and in the eyes of the law and the church, and we were further from each other than the 200 miles I'd traveled. We were two tired people standing on opposite banks of the same grief, his and the children's, and I had no boat. The thing that broke first wasn't the children, it was me. It happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks in. I remember because Thursday was wash day and my hands were raw from the cold water, and Pate, the 8-year-old, the one who hid behind the twins, had a fever. I found him on the stairs at midday, where he had no business being, gone the gray-white of bad milk and shaking. Ammon was out at the far fence with Carrick and Bly. The twins were at the schoolhouse 4 miles off. There was no one but me and Whit, who was too small to be any use except to stand in the doorway and watch with his enormous frightened eyes. I carried Pate to the big room, to her room, because it was the warmest and had the only proper bed, and because in that moment I did not care about a dead woman's territory. I cared about a living child burning up in my arms. I laid him down on Della Rourke's quilt, and I broke every unspoken rule in that house in the space of a breath, and I did not think about it once. He cried for her. Of course he did. Sick children cry for their mothers, and he was 8 and his was a year in the ground, and he said mama with his eyes shut and his fists in the quilt, and I want to tell you something I have never told anyone. I almost said I'm here. It rose right up in my throat, I'm here, baby, I'm here, the way it would for any child, and I caught it. I caught it and held it behind my teeth until it hurt, because it would have been a lie and a theft both, and he'd have hated me for it when the fever broke, and he remembered I wasn't her. So instead I sat on the floor beside the bed where she used to lie, and I put cool cloths on his forehead, and when he cried for his mother I said, I know you want her, I know. I said it over and over, not I'm here, just I know, the only true thing I had. And that was the morally heavy decision, though it didn't look like one. Anyone watching would have thought I simply nursed a sick boy, but I have turned it over 1,000 times since, and I am certain that the whole shape of what came after balanced on it, on the choice not to take a grieving child's confusion and use it to make him need me. I could have. He'd have let me in his fever. It would have been so easy, and it would have ruined everything. Because the one thing those boys could not forgive was being made to forget her, and I would have been asking an 8-year-old to do it in his sleep. When Carrick came in from the cold at dusk, and found me on the floor of his mother's room with his sick brother asleep against my arm. He stopped in the doorway like he'd hit glass. I braced for it, the accusation. You went in there, you used her bed. It didn't come. He stood there a long time. And then, 16 years old, hard as a winter, the boy who'd carried my trunk just to prove I couldn't carry my own weight. He looked at the cloths, and the basin, and his brother's color which had come back, and at me on the floor with my raw hands and my back against the bed frame. He always wants the room when he's sick, Carrick said. His voice had gone strange. Ma used to, he stopped, swallowed. She'd put him in there, said the window let in the morning. It does, I said, I noticed. He didn't answer, but he came in. He came and sat on the floor on the other side of the bed, his back against the wall, and he watched his brother breathe. And the two of us sat in the dark room of the dead woman neither of us would say we missed in our different ways, and we did not speak again for a long time. That was the first crack. Not a melting, not yet, just a hairline, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching the glass. But I was watching. I am always watching. It is the school teacher in me, the same thing that makes me count buttons. And I saw that night, sitting on the floor with Carrick work, that I had been wrong about the whole shape of the thing. I had thought my enemy was the boy's rejection. It wasn't. My enemy was their fear, the same fear that made me count. They were terrified that if they let me in, they'd lose her the rest of the way. That a new woman in the kitchen would scrub the last of Della Rourke off the walls, until there was nothing left to visit on the rise behind the barn. And I understood, sitting there, that I had been trying to fill her place. That was the mistake. You cannot fill a place like that, and the trying is an insult to everyone, the dead and the living both. What you can do, what I decided, somewhere in the small hours of that Thursday night, listening to a child I had no claim to breathing easy at last, is set a different place. Beside hers, not instead. I just didn't know yet how to show them. It would take me another 2 weeks to figure it out. It would take a box I found in the cellar, a recipe in a dead woman's handwriting, and a Sunday dinner I nearly didn't have the courage to cook. But that's the second half of the story. For now, I'll only tell you this. When the dawn came and the morning light fell through the window just like Carrick said it would, I looked across the bed and the boy was asleep, sitting up, his head against the wall, his face gone young again the way faces do in sleep. And I thought, God help me, I have come to the wrong place. And I thought in the very same breath, I am not leaving these children. Both things were true. I have learned that most true things come in pairs like that, fear and love holding hands, and that you don't get to keep only the one you'd prefer. I reached over slow, and I did the thing I'd been afraid to do for 3 weeks. I pulled Della's quilt up over her sleeping son's shoulders. And I left it there. I found the box on a Tuesday, looking for nothing. The cellar at the workplace was the kind that holds a year of fear in jars, beans and tomatoes, and the brittle paper-wrapped apples that get you to spring. I'd gone down for lard. What I came up with was a flat wooden box wedged behind the potato bin, and I'd have left it alone if it hadn't had a name burned into the lid in a child's uneven letters. Della. The kind of thing a husband makes badly because he loves the woman more than he understands a chisel. I should have closed it. I want that on the record. I stood there in the cellar cold with the lard in one hand, and I knew, the way you know a thing in your spine, that whatever was in that box did not belong to me. It belonged to the rise behind the barn. It belonged to the boys. I opened it anyway. I am not going to pretend I didn't. Inside was a hair ribbon gone soft with handling, a pressed flower so old it had given up its color, a baby's knitted cap, small enough to break your heart in your hands, and under it all, a stack of cards and torn paper, every one of them in the same closed, slanting hand, the hand from the sage jar on the kitchen shelf. Recipes. Dozens of them. Della's recipes in Della's writing, the everyday magic of a woman who'd fed 8 people 3 times a day on a ranch at the edge of the world. Bread. A way with beans that involved molasses and a long, patient hour I'd never have thought to give them. And on the very top, splattered and soft and clearly the most used of all of them, a card that said, simple as anything, Sunday chicken and dumplings, the boy's favorite. Don't rush the dumplings or Carrick sulks. I sat down on the cellar steps and I cried. I'm not ashamed of it. I cried for a woman I never met, who'd known her own son would sulk over a rushed dumpling and had loved him enough to write it down. I cried because I'd spent 5 weeks failing to feed these children, and the answer had been under the potatoes the whole time, written by the one person they'd never accuse of stealing anything. And then I had the thought that frightened me worse than the train, worse than the porch, worse than any of it. I could cook her recipe. Not my own. Not some city dish that proved how clever I was, the way I'd been quietly trying to do for 5 weeks, as though I could win these boys by being better than the woman in the ground. I could make her Sunday chicken and dumplings in her kitchen from her own hand, and set it on the table, and let them taste their mother again. It might melt them, or it might be the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to them, to put her food in front of them and her not there to have made it, to wave her ghost across the dinner table and then make them eat it. I sat on those steps a long time. This was the heaviest choice I made in that whole hard year, heavier than the night with the fever, because the night with the fever I'd had no time to be a coward, and this I had all the time in the world. I could have put the box back, cooked my own safe stew, kept failing slowly and politely until either they wore down or I did. I thought about Whit, who couldn't quite remember her. I thought about how unfair it was that the youngest should lose the most and keep the least. And I thought, if I do nothing, he forgets her entirely. If I do this, even if it costs me everything, that little boy gets one more Sunday with his mother's cooking before the memory closes over for good. I decided it was worth my standing in the house, if it bought him that. I took the card upstairs. I left the rest in the box, and I carried the box up too, and I set it on the kitchen table in plain sight, because I had decided I would do no more sneaking in that house. Whatever I did, I'd do it where they could see. I cooked it that Sunday. I'd never made dumplings in my life. I'm a schoolteacher's daughter. I can recite the kings of England, and I cannot, it turns out, make a dumpling that doesn't sink like a stone, and the first batch did exactly that, sat at the bottom of the pot like grief. I scooped them out and started over. I read her card so many times the ink blurred. Don't rush the dumplings, so I didn't. I gave them the long, patient hour the way I'd given the beans, and I stood at her stove on the worn place in her floor, and for the first time in 5 weeks it didn't feel like trespassing. It felt like being handed something. It felt like a woman I'd never met reaching back through her own handwriting to say, here, this is how. Take care of them. The smell got out of the kitchen before the food did. That's the thing about a smell, it goes where it wants, under doors, upstairs, out across a cold yard. I had the pot going by mid-afternoon and the whole house started to fill with it, that particular smell of chicken and broth and something underneath I couldn't name and didn't have to, because it wasn't mine to name. It was hers. Pate came first. He was well again, brown-cheeked and quick, and he stopped dead in the kitchen doorway and went very still in a way that no 8-year-old goes still. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his nose up like a young animal, and his eyes filled, and he turned around and left without a word. I let him go. Some things you let a child have in private. The twins came next, Sem and Job, drawn by their stomachs the way 11-year-old boys are drawn by anything edible, and they got 3 steps into the kitchen before one of them. The one with the scab, Sem, stopped and said, "That smells like," and didn't finish it. Couldn't. His brother grabbed his sleeve and the two of them stood there, identical and stricken, and then they backed out together the way they did everything together. I started to be afraid. I had done a terrible thing. By the time the light went long and gold and I called them to supper, my hands were shaking so badly I had to set the pot down twice on the way to the table. I'd laid 7 places, Ammon, the 6 boys, and then I'd stood looking at the 8th chair, hers, the one nobody sat in, and I'd made the second hard decision of the day. I set a plate there too. Empty, no food on it. Just a clean plate at Della Rourke's place, and her chipped blue cup beside it, and I left her chair pulled out the way you pull a chair out for someone you're expecting. I didn't explain it. I decided I wouldn't explain anything. I just cooked her food and set her place, and I would let them make of it what they would, and if they hated me for it, I would pack my trunk in the morning and they would at least have had this one Sunday. They came to the table slow. Ammon last in from the barn, and he stopped behind his own chair and looked at the pot, and then at the empty plate at the head of the table, and then at me, and I watched a man's whole face come apart very quietly. He didn't say anything either. None of them were saying anything. The whole family stood around that table in the gold light not saying anything, and I thought, I've broken them, I've broken all of them, what have I done? Carrick spoke first. Of course it was Carrick, the guard at the door, the boy who'd carried my trunk to prove I couldn't. "That's Ma's," he said. He was looking at the empty plate, his voice had gone to gravel. "Why'd you set Ma's place?" The whole room held its breath. Even Whit, who didn't understand, understood that much, that everything balanced here, on whatever I said next. I could have said something wise. I'd had all afternoon to think of something wise. But what came out was just the truth, the plain, unguarded truth, the same as I know on the floor that fevered night. "Because she made this," I said. "I only followed what she wrote down. I didn't change a thing. Well, I changed it twice, but only because I sank the dumplings and she warned me not to rush them, and I should have listened. A couple of them made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, the wet kind. This is hers. I just cooked it, so it seemed wrong for her not to have a place at her own table." Carrick stared at me. 16 years of holding the door shut. "You're not trying to be her," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." "No," I said. "I couldn't if I wanted to, and I'd never want to. I'm not here to take her chair, Carrick. There's another one. I'll sit in that one." And I went and I sat down in the plain chair at the side, the stranger's chair, the one nobody had assigned me, and I left her seat at the head of the table empty with its empty plate, and I put my hands in my lap and I waited. The boy looked at me for a long moment. Then he pulled out his own chair and he sat. And one by one, like something thawing, the rest of them sat too, around their mother's empty place, and we ate her Sunday chicken and dumplings together in the falling light. Nobody talked much at first. Then Pate said, quiet, "It tastes right." And the twins started arguing about which of them had eaten more of it the last time she made it, 2 years gone, and the argument got loud and ordinary and beautiful. And Bly, silent, watchful Bly, told a story about the time she chased Sem around the yard with the wooden spoon, and I learned more about Della Rourke in that one supper than in 5 weeks of standing in her kitchen, because they would only talk about her once they knew I wasn't there to scrub her away. I had thought the dinner would melt them toward me. That's the vain way I'd imagined it all those afternoons. That's not what happened. The dinner melted them toward her. It gave them back the thing they'd been clenching so hard they couldn't feel it, the right to miss her out loud at the table. With food in their mouths and tears on their faces and nobody, least of all the new woman, telling them it was time to stop. And somewhere in there, without my noticing the exact moment, the missing her out loud started to include me. Not as her, as the one who'd handed her back to them. Pate moved his chair closer to mine to reach the bread and didn't move it away again. Whit, who'd been confused by the whole solemn affair, climbed down off his seat halfway through and came around the table and leaned against my arm the way a small, tired child leans, with his whole trusting weight, and asked if there was more of the soft parts, meaning dumplings, and I gave him mine. Across the table, Ammon Rourke watched his sons eat their mother's cooking made by his stranger wife's hands, and watched the youngest lean on me, and he put his fork down and pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes for a second, just one, the way a proud man does when he isn't going to let it become more than a second. And when he took his hand away, he looked at me down the length of that crowded table, past the empty chair that wasn't a wound anymore but a welcome, and he said the only thing he said the whole meal. "Thank you, Alina." My name, not Miss Vane, not the careful nothing he'd called me for 5 weeks. My name, the way you say a name when you've decided to keep the person. I counted the people at the table. I couldn't help it. The habit doesn't ask permission. 1 through 6, and Ammon made 7, and the empty place made 8, and I made 9. And for the first time since the platform at Lewisham, crossing the counting didn't feel like fear. It felt like inventory. Like a woman taking stock of everything she has and finding, to her astonishment, that it is more than she came with. I would like to tell you it was easy after that. It wasn't. Carrick and I had a hard winter still ahead of us. A boy doesn't unclench all at once, and there were nights he tested me and nights I wanted the train. Bly took the longest to trust, and Pate had bad dreams clear through the spring. Whit started calling me by a name halfway between my own and another one, and I let him, and I never corrected him toward either, because some things a child should be allowed to decide for himself in his own time. But we kept her chair. That was the thing we never stopped doing. Every Sunday, her place at the head of the table, her chipped blue cup, her empty plate. Some weeks the boys piled it high with the food she'd loved and left it for the birds in the morning. Some weeks they left it bare. It was theirs to decide. I only cooked. And I cooked from her box, that whole first year, her bread, her beans, her Sunday chicken, until somewhere in there, without either of us marking the day, I started to add a card or two of my own to the stack. In my hand, not hers. Different recipes. New ones. Set right there in the same box with a name burned crooked in the lid, hers and then mine, the two of us layered in a wooden box behind the potatoes like the geology of one family's whole long love. People ask me sometimes, the few people out here who know my story, whether I ever resented it. Cooking a dead woman's recipes. Sitting beside her empty chair my whole married life. Mothering 6 boys who cried for someone else. And I tell them the truth, which is the same answer I have given to everything since that platform. That I came to the wrong place, and that I never left, and that both of those are true, and that you don't get to keep only the one you'd prefer. She set the table, Della Rourke. Years before I ever stepped off that train, she said it, in her close slanting hand, "Don't rush the dumplings." I only pulled out the chair. Whit is grown now. He has children of his own, and on Sundays they crowd a table I'm too old to cook for the way I used to. There's a wooden box that goes to whichever of the boys' wives wants it most, and there's a hair ribbon in it gone soft with handling, and a baby's knitted cap, and recipes in 2 different hands that the grandchildren can't tell apart and don't need to. And at the head of the table every Sunday, there is still an empty place. I don't always remember to count the people anymore. But when I do, I never seem to get the same number twice, because the table keeps getting longer, and that